For 11 chapters, the Apostle Paul has been communicating to us the marvelous workings of God. He has done this in the following ways. First, after he tells us why he's qualified to, quote-unquote, lecture us on these great truths, he gives us his resume. He tells us what the gospel is. It is the righteousness of God revealed from heaven. Second, he then spends the next 10-plus chapters telling us the how, the why, and the what of this righteousness of God. And that would be, thirdly, it is the righteousness of God which must break into the human arena due to man's utter and complete fallenness, his total alienation from God because of this sinful disposition, which not only separates him from God, but creates hostility towards God. This applies to all of mankind. Male, female, Jew, Gentile, everyone is guilty before God. Fourth, this righteousness of God, which penetrates man's sinful disposition, which is so radically pervasive in mankind that mankind is simply incapable, unable, bears no ability to remove himself from this sinful nature by his own efforts, works, or deeds, which situation required God to remove man from this sinful condition by divine act. Fifth, the manner in which God has chosen to remove mankind is through faith alone in his Son alone, whom the Father sent to bear the guilty and penalty for man's sin. Sixth, this faith, which was first presented to us by the Old Testament church, Israel, is the means by which God justifies us before himself. Though they didn't escape the pervasive nature of sin, it was through his people, that God provided this righteousness of God. Seventh, from this act, this event, this intrusion, God then brings men of all languages, races, and nations to himself. First Jews, then Gentiles. He justifies them. He sanctifies them. He glorifies them. He has chosen them from all eternity and actually removed his natural children in order to graft into his eternal family those who were not his children, setting aside those whom he loved for a period of time to show his sovereign choosing, his unfathomable mercy and grace, his infinite divine desire to bring all people, especially his natural children, back to him, even if it means driving them to jealousy if necessary. This is what Paul has been saying for 11 chapters, which brings him to this section of Scripture in which he shouts an exclamation. What should be clear in the manner in which St. Paul has proceeded from chapter 1 until this section is that God has a plan that is beyond anything we could have imagined. In the very first chapter, Paul makes it clear that not only is the righteousness of God revealed from heaven, but so is God's wrath, the corollary to his righteousness revealed from heaven. Because God has made it clear that all things were created by him and all things exist through him, and due to man's sin, man has abused, mangled, distorted the very creation God gave to man as a sign of God's power and sovereignty. And out of this, Paul utters a virtual spontaneous outburst of praise, thanksgiving, and wonder. Behind all the machinations of human history stands the sovereign, electing God. He is the creator of everyone and of everything. And all things exist by and through his power, which in creation man has seen and has thoroughly distorted. And And once again, even here, in this very brief doxology, we see the importance of an allusion to the creation account. Even in Paul's outburst of praise, we see how important understanding that it is God that has created all things, and how important Genesis is to that explanation. We see creation. Paul has reflected upon the fact that the Jews had been consigned, they've been relegated, shut up, if you will, for a time in unbelief, in order that the Gentiles would come to belief, in order that God may show mercy on all, especially all of his Jewish remnant. Paul has reflected upon the mystery of Gentile union and identification with the true vine of Israel, who of course is Jesus. He's discussed the meaning of Romans 1:16 through 18. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, the Jew first, also to the Greek. For therein, the gospel, is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold this truth in unrighteousness. And this prompts an outburst of admiration, of adoration, and awe from the apostle. In the very first verse, who has known the mind of God? Paul has expounded to us in 11 chapters the mind of God in salvation. He has explained man's state in relation to God. He has spoken of the true nature of saving faith. We have seen the unveiling of the great mystery hidden from all ages. Jew and Gentile would be one body, one communion, one synagogue, one ecclesia, one church. And this would happen by and because of a temporary setting aside of the Jews. This should cause us to marvel at God's sovereign grace. Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong unto the Lord our God, but those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. The mystery had been concealed for ages, and now that mystery has been revealed to us. The secret things of God have been revealed to us. Jew and Gentile, male and female, chosen naturally, and those not of the natural body have been melded together. The marvel of God's sovereign grace is what Paul is emphasizing. And notice the change in his presentation. Remember how Paul used to deal with these types of situations. Usually, when he presents something, quote-unquote, controversial to his readers, he anticipates their objection, and then he provides a response, an answer, as a lawyer would do. He doesn't do that here. Imagine what would have been the anticipated response to Paul's statement that the Jews are set aside. They are consigned. They are sealed. They are shut up in unbelief. How many Jews would have sat back and said, yeah, no big deal, Paul, you're right. Imagine the backlash he would have received for making such an assertion. But there are no depths to which one can dive, no mountains to which one can climb, no calculation one can figure, no amount of understanding, wisdom, or knowledge that can plumb the depths of the wisdom and knowledge of God. The Creator far surpasses any imagery of his creation. The sovereign transcendence of God is beyond our highest imagination. And Paul again refers his readers, as he does continually, back to the Old Testament. Isaiah 40:13. Who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord, or being his counselor hath taught him? Jeremiah 23:18. For who hath stood in the counsel of the Lord, and hath perceived, and heard his word? Who hath marked his word, and heard it? Job 36:22. Behold, God exalteth by his power. Who teacheth him? And this was so important to the apostle that he actually repeats Isaiah 40:13 in 1 Corinthians 2:16. And all of this, the profundity of the thoughts and minds of God, should drive us to Isaiah 55:8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So Paul is not sitting here and giving some sort of legal response to any perceived or anticipated objection. He is praising God and reminding everyone of simply of who God is. In 34, who has been the counselor of God? One of my wife's favorite passages, the last section of Job, 38, 1 through 4. She actually likes the whole last section of Job. But then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Paul is saying for 11 chapters, I've sat here and expounded the mind of God, and who are you to sit there and contradict what God's mind is? Do you really believe that you have the wisdom to counsel God in his outworking of salvation? Do you really believe that you can stand with God to provide him information as to what he should do? And remember what I said about the whirlwind, the cloud. This is God responding to Job as, if you will, an example, an avatar, for those that like game playing, of mankind. And God is speaking from the whirlwind, from his heavenly throne, with the heavenly court standing by him, with the angels antiphonally praising him above him, and he looks at man and he says, who are you to tell me anything? That passage alone should be printed out, taped to our refrigerators, tattooed to our eyelids, every time we sit here and we think that we have the right to question anything that God does. Why somebody lives and somebody dies. Why something happens here and doesn't happen there. Why some are saved and some aren't. Do we have the right to counsel God? Were we there when he fastened Orion's belt? When he stretched out the Pleiades? When he put Leviathan in the ocean? This is what Paul is telling us. And not only who has been God's counselor, but to whom does God owe anything? Again, in Job 41, verse 11. Who hath prevented me that I should repay him? Whatsoever is under the whole of heaven is mine. And that prevented comes more from the Latin, the prevenio, the coming before. In other words, Paul is citing this section of Job, and what God is saying is, who has come before me and presented anything to me in order to get me to respond in any way that I owe them a certain response based upon what they've done. Who has prevented me? Who has come to me and given me anything? How can one praise God enough when considering all that St. Paul has written up to this point? What more fitting a summation of this doctrinal masterpiece than this paean of praise? How appropriate it is to end this doctrinal presentation with the glorifying of the sovereignty of God as it is juxtaposed with man's utter rejection of God from the very beginning in Romans 1:18 through 23. Remember, that's what is the backdrop. Paul simply didn't start with, this is the righteousness of God. He said, this is the righteousness of God because, and he goes into that spiraling decline of sin in the remainder of Romans. As Reformed people, we're always confronted by those who disagree with us that our doctrine is cruel, it's unfair, it's heartless. The only thing I can say to that is they've obviously never studied this section in Romans. Contrary to God's complete and utter sovereignty, especially in salvation, being something sad and distasteful, God's complete and utter sovereignty causes the Apostle Paul to break out in an unabashed, unhindered, doxological praise and joy. For Paul, predestination and election are not doctrines of horror. They are divine expressions of transcendent mercy. They are divine expressions of transcendent grace. They are divine expressions of transcendent sacrifice. And they are divine expressions of transcendent love. It was foreordained that Jesus would take the place of his elect on the cross and suffer the condemnation, guilt, and penalty for their sin. And note this, guaranteeing, not possibly suggesting, not making it capable, guaranteeing their redemption and salvation. What is more loving and joyful and praiseworthy than that? I'm going to close with one of my favorite all-time hymns. I'm going to read the first stanza. Written by Charles Wesley. And I dare say, in my humble opinion, we've been singing this incorrectly since Brother Charles wrote it. I want to read this to you. And I want you to listen to this. And I want you to take this with you and meditate on this as you think about everything that the apostle has written up to this point. And can it be that I should gain an interest in the Savior's blood? Died he for me, who caused his pain? For me, to him who death pursued. Amazing love. How can it be that thou, my God, hast died for me?